Hey guys, tonight, we're stepping into a forest that feels like it's been waiting for you for over 1,000 years. The mist is thick enough to bead on your eyelashes, the smell of wet pine needles wraps around you, and the ground gives that muffled crunch under your boots that makes every step sound like you're sneaking into a secret. Somewhere ahead, hooves drum softly against an old Roman road. This isn't just a casual royal hunt. It's the kind of day where one wrong turn will end a dynasty. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive it if you were the man we're following, but for now, you're safe just walking in his shadow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where all my late-night history wanderers are tuning in from. It's like building our own little map across centuries and continents. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 679 CE. We're in the dense, damp embrace of the Ardennes forest in the eastern reaches of the Frankish kingdom of Austrasia. The birds have gone quiet, which is never a good sign in any century. Riding just ahead is King Dagobert II. His cloak a deep royal blue that makes him stand out even in this gray light. His hair, long, uncut, and heavy, is more than just style. In the Merovingian world, hair is political capital, spiritual armor, and the clearest visible sign that you are not just a ruler, but a sacred one. Chroniclers of the time were clear-cut a Merovingian king's hair, and you cut his claim to the throne. Imagine if your entire right to rule could be revoked by a trip to the barber. But here's the first odd detail: Dagobert had not been on the throne for long. Only a few years earlier, he was living in exile in Ireland under the protection of the church. Then, in a neat twist of political theater, the same church helped restore him to power. Bishops and nobles gave their blessing, which is the medieval equivalent of getting a LinkedIn recommendation from someone you think is on your side. And yet here we are following him into the woods, where someone in this party, maybe right beside him, is not his friend. The road narrows as the forest swallows the light. You can hear the breathing of the horses, the creak of leather saddles. In one version of the story, Dagobert is gradually separated from his guards, perhaps under the pretense of chasing game. In another, a servant betrays him outright. The method of the killing is debated. Some accounts claim a spear to the eye, others a knife to the throat, but the result is the same: the king is dead before the day is over. And that's where the story starts to get even stranger. You'd expect an uproar, right? A royal funeral, public mourning, a little righteous outrage from the nobles. Instead, the chronicles barely mention it, and when they do, it's in clipped, cautious tones. It's as if the scribes themselves were afraid to write too much, or perhaps were ordered not to. Historians still argue whether this was simply medieval politics at its coldest, or the opening move in something much deeper, an intentional erasure of a bloodline. And then the real disappearance: Sigisbert IV, Dagobert's son and legitimate heir, doesn't take the throne. He doesn't even get an obituary. No coronation, no rebellion, no exile, notice nothing. His name drops out of the official record like a stone sinking into dark water. It's a neat trick. If you never write down that someone existed, it's much easier for future generations to forget them. But the whispers are harder to silence. Some say Sigisbert fled south to the Languedoc region, where the landscape of mountains, rivers, and fortified towns made it easy to hide. Others say monks loyal to the Merovingian cause smuggled him into a secluded abbey. And then there's the boldest version, the one that will follow us all night: that Sigisbert lived under another name, married, and had children whose descendants are alive today. You push through a low branch, the scent of crushed pine needles sharp in the cold air. The ground is uneven here, scattered with moss-covered stones that might once have been part of a Roman milestone. In the clearing ahead, The king's horse stands restless steam rising from its flanks. Dagobert does not rise to greet you. Whatever has just happened, it's over in moments, but the echo will stretch for centuries. The Merovingians were no ordinary royal house. They didn't just claim to be chosen by God, they claimed to be descended from King David from Abraham, and according to some fringe traditions, from a carpenter in Galilee and a red-haired woman who fled by sea. Mainstream historians dismiss this as legend, but the detail is stubborn: a woman with red hair crossing the Mediterranean carrying a child full of prophecy. That's not the kind of image that shows up in court poetry by accident. And here's the thing. Merovingian kings ruled with a mix of political pragmatism and mysticism that unsettled the medieval church. They healed by touch-saw visions and followed old pagan Christian hybrid rituals that made them seem less like monarchs and more like living saints. They didn't need the Pope to crown them. Their authority was baked into their birth. Which, if you're the Pope, is the political equivalent of someone opening a competing coffee shop across the street and offering better Wi-Fi. Now look around this forest one more time. The hunting party is moving again, but they're leaving someone behind. The horses pick their way over the old stones, the sound fading into the mist. Somewhere between these trees, a dynasty just ended, not with a coup or a battlefield charge, but with the kind of quiet that lets you bury more than just a man. You feel it even now, centuries later, the moment where history changes direction, and a bloodline with its own claim to the sacred is pushed into shadow. And if you lean in, really listen, you might catch what the wind's been carrying ever since: a story that refuses to stay buried. You're still in that silence, the kind that comes after something irreversible. The horses have gone, their hoofbeats fading until they're just memory. Ahead, a shaft of pale light falls between the trees, catching on the faint drift of mist. You step toward it, and before you know it, the forest floor has turned into the polished stone of a long, echoing hall. The air is cooler here, carrying the faint scent of beeswax and incense. On either side, figures in carved relief watch you pass: men with flowing hair, some holding swords, others raising hands in blessing. You're walking among the Merovingians now. They don't look like the usual medieval kings you see in textbooks. No short-cropped hair, no neat coronation portraits. Their hair is long, heavy, and deliberate, falling well past their shoulders. It's not fashion, it's law. They're called the Reges Criniti, the long-haired kings, and for them, those locks are more than vanity. Chroniclers wrote that a Merovingian shorn of his hair was stripped of divine authority, as if the scissors could sever the invisible thread between heaven and crown. It's one of those details that sounds like myth until you realize how seriously everyone treated it enough that rivals would actually imprison a king and shave him to make him ineligible to rule. Mainstream history books will tell you the Merovingians ruled much of what is now France, Belgium, and parts of Germany between the 5th and 8th centuries. But if you stand here a little longer, you can see how their power wasn't just about territory. They moved in a world that blended Roman inheritance with deep-rooted Frankish tradition. They didn't only win battles, they cultivated an aura. And here's a quirky tidbit: they claimed descent from a part mythical founder named Merovesh, who, according to later legend, was conceived when his mother encountered a strange sea creature while swimming. Historians still argue whether that story was an old pagan symbol for divine favor or just a colorful bit of royal propaganda. Either way, it gave the dynasty a shimmer of the otherworldly, half-human, half-something else. As you move deeper into the hall, sunlight filters through high, narrow windows, striking the gold threads woven into tapestries. Scenes play out there, kings laying hands on the sick, receiving visions in the night. Anointing warriors not with swords, but with oil from a mysterious vial said to have come down from heaven itself. One figure, Clovis Ninon, stands out. He's depicted being baptized in Reims around the year 496. In the official version, a dove descends from heaven, carrying a vial of holy oil, the Sainte Ampoule, which would later be used to crown French kings for centuries. It's a beautiful scene, but it's also political theater, a pagan warlord transformed into a Christian monarch with the church's blessing. Still, the Merovingians never quite gave up the old ways. Their coronations might have Christian prayers, but their talismans and charms were often older than the Bible they swore on. They consulted seers, claimed prophetic dreams, and wove a sense of sacred destiny into their reign. That mixture, part sanctioned by Rome, part defiantly independent, made them hard to control. And the long hair wasn't their only symbol. Bees, tiny and golden, appear again and again in their art and grave goods. When the tomb of King Childeric I was opened in the 17th century, more than 300 little gold bees were found around his remains. Archaeologists debate whether they were meant as symbols of immortality or resurrection, but either way, they weren't just decoration. In the ancient world, bees were messengers between realms, creatures that could cross from life to death and back again. If you're starting to get the sense that the Merovingians were playing a very long symbolic game, you're not wrong. The hall narrows, and you find yourself beside a throne, not gilded, but carved from dark wood, its arms twisting into shapes of serpents and curling vines. There's no crown here, just a single lock of golden hair resting where a king's head would be. It's quiet enough to hear your own breath. These rulers didn't just govern, they inhabited a role halfway between monarch and relic, and in a way that made them more dangerous than any warlord. They didn't need to prove themselves on the battlefield to justify their rule, though many did. Their right to the throne was quite literally in their blood. That brings you back to the forest where Dagobert II fell. His hair, his lineage, his mystique, all of it ended in a moment. Or at least that's what the official record wants you to think. But here's where the tension hums just beneath the stone floor. If a king like this could be removed quietly without uproar, what did his rivals fear most? His armies, his alliances, or the whisper that his family tree reached back to somewhere the church didn't want traced? Historians still argue about how much of the Merovingian self-image was sincere belief, and how much was calculated politics. Were they truly convinced they were semi-divine, or was it simply the smartest branding campaign of the early Middle Ages? Maybe it doesn't matter. The effect was the same, a dynasty that merged the old gods with the new gospel, a living bridge between pagan Europe and Christian empire. And in that space, they built something you can still feel, a kind of electricity in the air, like you're standing just inside the edge of a storm. You glance again at the carved faces along the walls. The eyes are deep set, almost alive. Somewhere in a chapter no one was meant to read, there's a link tying these kings to a carpenter from Galilee and a woman whose story the Gospels tell only in fragments. And whether that link was forged in truth or in legend, it was enough to make someone somewhere decide that the Merovingians had to be replaced. The hall begins to dim, the figures fading into shadow, until you're back at the far end. The throne is empty now, the lock of hair gone. In its place, only the faint scent of honey remains, as if the bees themselves have retreated into the walls. You step back into the cool air, and the door closes quietly behind you. Somewhere in the dark, the long-haired kings still wait, their crowns invisible, their symbols hidden in plain sight. The stone of the hall is still cool under your fingertips, when the air changes warmer now, carrying the briny tang of a distant sea. The echo of beeswax and incense fades into the sound of slow waves slapping against wood. You blink, and the carved pillars around you give way to the open deck of a small, weather-worn boat. The mast creaks in the wind, but there's no sail, no rudder, no crew steering. Only a handful of passengers sit in quiet determination, huddled against the gusts. One of them is a woman with a scarf loose around her head hair, the color of fresh chestnuts glinting red in the sun. You don't need an introduction. You already know the stories. Mary Magdalene, once standing at the foot of the cross, now seated on the worn planks of a vessel adrift in the Mediterranean. The canonical Gospels end her story abruptly witness to the resurrection, and then nothing. But here in the retelling whispered along the southern coast of France for over 1,000 years, she sails on. The legend says she wasn't alone. Two other Marys are with her, Mary Salome and Mary Jacobi, along with a small retinue. In some versions, she carries something more than memory, she carries a child. The coastline ahead is rugged, framed by scrubby pines clinging to sun-baked rock. This is Provence, though the name won't be used for centuries. The boat drifts toward a sandy inlet, now known as Sainte-Marie de la Mer. The local telling says the sea brought them safely without crew, guided by providence or fate, depending on who you ask. You step off with them, feeling the coarse sand under your shoes, the hot wind tugging at your clothes. For the people who still live here, this moment isn't just folklore, it's heritage. Every May they carry statues of the three Marys to the shore. The Romani people dancing in honor of Saint Sarah the Black Madonna, who, according to tradition, also came ashore that day. Candles float on the water, prayers rise in the salt air, and the old chants mix with the crash of the waves. Mainstream historians call this pious invention a medieval flourish designed to attract pilgrims. And maybe it is. But quirky little details keep poking through that neat dismissal. Chapels dedicated to Mary Magdalene appear in southern France centuries before the Catholic Church formally elevated her status. Frescoes from the early medieval period show her not as a penitent prostitute that later smear campaign, but as a regal figure in blue holding a vessel. Sometimes she's alone. Sometimes she's standing beside a boy. Historians still argue whether these are just symbolic depictions of Christ's spiritual offspring or sly nods to a literal bloodline. You follow her inland, now climbing toward the hills of Saint-Baume. Here, tucked into the cliffs, is a cave, a cool, dark sanctuary said to be where she spent the last 30 years of her life in prayer. The path up is steep, winding through forests of oak and beech, the air thick with the scent of wild thyme. Inside the cave feels like another world. Candles flicker in niches cut into the stone. The ceiling weeps, slow droplets that patter onto the floor. Pilgrims have come here for over 1,000 years, believing her tears once hollowed the rock. It's in places like this that the legend folds into something harder to shrug off. Why here, why her, and why so much persistence in tying her to this landscape? The church kept her in a carefully defined box for centuries, repentant sinner follower of Jesus, nothing more, but here in Provence, she's remembered differently. Here she's a matriarch, a founder. That's where the bloodline theory takes its boldest leap. In this telling, Mary Magdalene arrived not just with companions, but with a child, her child with Jesus. That child raised far from the reach of Jerusalem, and Rome would grow up among the local nobility. Over generations, that blood would merge with the Frankish elite, eventually flowing into the veins of the Merovingian kings. Mainstream historians roll their eyes here. There's no hard evidence. But absence can be suspicious too. Why is there no mention of her fate in early church writings when they went to such lengths to catalog the lives and deaths of other saints? Why no tomb in the Holy Land, no relics, no shrine until centuries later in France? A gust sweeps through the cave, fluttering the candle flames. You picture her here, the woman who, according to some apocryphal texts, was closer to Jesus than any other disciple, even called his koinonos in the Gospel of Philip. That Greek word can mean companion, but in certain contexts, it also means partner or spouse. Scholars still argue over which meaning is intended, but once you've heard both, it's hard to unhear. You step back out into the sunlight. the view spilling wide across the Provençal countryside. The fields below ripple with lavender, and in the far distance the silver line of the sea. Somewhere between that shoreline and these hills, the story changes from exile to legacy. Whether it's history or just the kind of myth that feels like it should be true, it has endured through crusades, inquisitions, revolutions, and centuries of official silence. And as you start down the path, you can almost hear the voices from that first landing carried on the wind, a woman who refuses to vanish, a child who will grow into a king, and a lineage that, if the whispers are right, still walks among us. The sunlight on the Provençal hills fades, and with it, the sea breeze that carried Mary's story inland. You're standing now in a dim corridor of a monastery, the air cool and dry, smelling faintly of stone and old parchment. Somewhere beyond these walls, the child from the whispers, Sigisbert the Fiotr, has been hidden. Whether he's here or somewhere further south, you can't say for sure, but the quiet feels intentional. The official histories don't linger on him. In fact, they barely mention his name at all. After Dagobert II's murder in the Ardennes forest, Sigisbert should have been the next king of Austrasia. He was the legitimate heir, the last in a line of rulers who claimed their crown by birthright rather than papal favor. But instead of a coronation, there's a gap, a neat, silent erasure. Mainstream historians will tell you this was simply politics, Pepin of Herstal, and the rising Carolingian faction consolidating power. But fringe accounts and the oral traditions that survive in a few stubborn corners of France tell a different story. In these tellings, Sigisbert doesn't die young. He's spirited away by loyalists, monks, or perhaps even foreign allies, and given a new name. Some versions place him in the Languedoc, that tangle of hills and rivers in the south, where borders blur and local lords answer only loosely to kings. Others suggest he was sheltered by monastic orders sympathetic to the Merovingians, protected in exchange for what, a promise, a relic, or simply because they believed his bloodline carried something too valuable to lose. You move down the corridor, your footsteps echoing. A tall window lets in a shaft of late afternoon light, illuminating a wooden chest pushed into a corner. You can't open it, of course, but you notice the carvings on its lid bees, tiny and deliberate, flanked by the fleur-de-lis. These symbols are anachronistic for the supposed time of Sigisbert's exile, yet here they are paired as if they've always belonged together. A monk passes silently, his sandals whispering over the flagstones. You nod, but he doesn't meet your eyes. It's a reminder that in every century there are people who know more than they're willing or allowed to say. And this is where the trail of Sigisbert turns slippery. In one thread of the story, he marries into a local noble family, his descendants weaving themselves so thoroughly into the fabric of the region that generations later no one could trace the line without unraveling half the aristocracy. In another, he remains cloistered, a living relic in his own right, his identity known only to a handful of sworn guardians. There's even a more romantic, if less likely version, that he traveled into the Pyrenees and beyond, seeking alliances across the mountains. Some modern enthusiasts have tried to connect him to noble houses in northern Spain, pointing to similarities in heraldry. But historians still argue whether those resemblances are anything more than coincidence. The problem, of course, is evidence. A few charters from the period mention names suspiciously close to Sigisbert's, but medieval spelling was more suggestion than rule, and a scribe's flourish could change Sigisbertus into something unrecognizable. Still, when you see the name Sigibert pop up in a 7th century monastery ledger hundreds of miles from Austrasia, it's hard not to raise an eyebrow. You reach the end of the corridor and push open a heavy wooden door. Outside, the sun is dipping toward the horizon, the light turning the stone walls gold. You can hear water nearby, the slow trickle of a fountain in a cloister garden. It's a good place to hide, you think, somewhere where the rhythm of prayer and seasons could blur the years until a boy becomes a man, and a man becomes just another quiet figure in the order's history. But hiding a person is one thing. Hiding a bloodline is another. That takes planning marriages arranged with surgical precision records that tell half-truths and allies willing to keep a secret, not for years, but for generations. Whether or not Sigisbert's protectors succeeded is the question that still hums underneath this whole story. If they failed, the line ended here in the cloister's shadows. If they succeeded, it may still be out there, wearing a dozen different surnames, living unnoticed in the most ordinary places. You walk past the fountain. The water catches the fading light, and for a moment, it looks like liquid gold. You think of Dagobert's death again, of the forest clearing, and the sudden quiet that followed. It's tempting to believe that this hidden survival was the answer to that silence. That somewhere the Merovingian line was still breathing even if history refused to record it. And in the rustle of the garden leaves, you can almost hear it, a thread pulled taut through centuries waiting for someone to find its other end. The garden air is still on your skin when you start to notice them, the shapes you've been seeing over and over again without quite realizing it. They're carved into lintels, woven into tapestries, pressed into the wax seals of old letters. You follow them like breadcrumbs out of the monastery and into a narrow medieval street where sunlight pours over the faded stone walls. First comes the bee. Small, golden, almost easy to overlook if you're not paying attention. It turns up in unexpected places in the ironwork of a balcony etched into a corner of a merchant's sign tucked into the margins of an illuminated manuscript. In Merovingian times, it was more than a decorative flourish. Bees symbolized resurrection, eternal life, and a connection between worlds. When the tomb of King Childeric the Fine was opened in the 17th century, over 300 tiny golden bees were found around his body, each one crafted with almost obsessive care. To a Merovingian, a bee was as much a royal seal as any crown. Then, the fleur-de-lis. Today it's the emblem of France, printed on tourist souvenirs and football jerseys, but in the centuries before it became a Bourbon trademark, it appears in stranger contexts. Here in the Old Quarter, you spot one carved above a door, not stylized and stiff like the modern version, but flowing almost floral, the curves unmistakably feminine. Some fringe historians insist this older form represented not a lily, but a trinity of figures, father, mother, and child. Mainstream scholars dismiss this as poetic overreach, yet the more you look, the harder it is to unsee the idea. And then there are the stars. Not the five-pointed kind you'd expect from a medieval coat of arms, but seven-pointed, etched faintly into cornerstones, or traced in stained glass. The heptagram in ancient symbology represents the union of the spiritual and the earthly two realms, meeting in a perfect, unbroken loop. Historians still argue whether the Merovingians consciously used it, or whether it was an older pagan carryover, but either way, it pops up too often to be random. You trail these motifs from one street to the next, the air warm with the smell of baking bread and wood smoke. A gust of wind catches a tapestry hanging from a window, and there it is again, a bee stitched into the border so small, you'd miss it if you weren't looking. Someone somewhere wanted these marks to survive even if their meaning didn't. Fast forward in your mind 1,000 years, and you'll see the bee return in the most unlikely place embroidered into Napoleon Bonaparte's coronation robe. He bypassed the fleur-de-lis of the Bourbon kings and went straight for the Merovingian bee, covering his imperial banners and seals with it. Officially, he said it symbolized French industriousness. Unofficially, well, it's hard not to think he was making a statement linking himself to a lineage older than the Carolingians, older than the Capetians, maybe even older than the church's blessing itself. You turn a corner and step into the cool shadow of a church. It's not grand, no soaring vaults or marble altars, just a small parish building with worn pews and walls painted in soft ochres. Near the door, there's a baptismal font shaped in the round, but its rim is decorated with alternating bees and fleur-de-lis. You run your hand over the carvings, feeling the shallow grooves. The symbolism is layered life renewal, royal legitimacy. Was it the work of a pious stonemason paying homage to the monarchy, or was it a quiet nod to something less officially sanctioned, a bloodline meant to be remembered in symbols rather than words? Above the altar, sunlight filters through a stained glass panel. The main image is of the Virgin Mary, but tucked in the corner, almost like a signature, is a 7-pointed star. You imagine the craftsman who set those pieces centuries ago slipping in the design with the hope or maybe the certainty that someone someday would notice. Outside again, you pass a market stall selling old coins. Most are the usual assortment of tarnished copper and worn silver, but one catches your eye, a Merovingian gold tremisses, its surface marked with a crude portrait, and beneath it, a tiny deliberate bee. You hold it in your palm for a moment, thinking about how many hands it's passed through since it was minted. Traders, soldiers, farmers, each touching a symbol they might not fully understand, but that carried meaning for those who minted it. This is how symbols survive, not because everyone remembers their origin, but because enough people find them pleasing or familiar enough to keep using. And in that persistence, the meaning lingers even if it's obscured. The bee still hums in the metal. The fleur-de-lis still curls in stone. The star still shines in glass. You start to see them everywhere now. On the corner of a faded banner in a town square, in the mosaic floor of a crumbling cloister, even in the embroidery of a shawl worn by a woman passing you in the street. Maybe they've become habit-emptied of their original weight. Or maybe they're still doing exactly what they were meant to do, mark a presence without naming it. And as you walk out of the old quarter, the sun dipping low, you get the uncanny sense that the symbols aren't just reminders, they're watchful. Bees poised in still flight. Lilies caught mid-bloom. Stars forever turning. It's as if they're waiting for the right pair of eyes to recognize them. The market's chatter fades behind you, replaced by the slow, rhythmic clop of hooves on cobblestones. You follow the sound until the streets widen into a windswept square, its center dominated by a blocky stone church, whose foundations seem older than the rest of the town. A row of weather-blackened statues guards the entrance saints martyrs, and one knight holding his sword like a scepter. You step past him and into the shadowed nave. The air smells faintly of candle wax and damp limestone. Your footsteps echo softly as you move toward the chancel, but it's not the altar that draws your attention. It's the floor. A section of worn flagstones seems subtly out of place, their edges just a little too straight, as if they've been lifted and reset more than once. In the dim quiet, you can almost hear them shovels scraping boots shifting on stone. The year is 1118 now, and you're standing on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The knights here are not yet the legendary warrior monks of popular imagination. They're a small band sworn to protect pilgrims along the dangerous road from Jaffa to the Holy City. But their headquarters isn't some barracks outside the walls. It's inside what was once the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built on the ruins of the biblical Temple of Solomon. Officially, they're there to guard the holy site. Unofficially, they dig. For 9 years. Not digging to repair foundations or build fortifications, digging with no public explanation at all. Historians still argue what they were looking for. Some say they sought the Ark of the Covenant, the chest said to hold the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. Others think they were after early Christian relics or long-lost scrolls from the Second Temple period. But among the more persistent and more dangerous theories is this: they were looking for proof of a bloodline. Not a metaphorical one, but names, dates, and genealogies, that could tie Jesus of Nazareth directly to descendants living in Europe. The evidence for this is slippery, but the shift in the Templars' fortunes after their Jerusalem years is undeniable. When they return to Europe, they are transformed, wealthier, more powerful, and far more secretive. They begin building churches and commanderies in a distinctive style full of circular designs and geometric precision. The layout of some sites mirrors constellations. Others echo ancient mystical diagrams. The architecture whispers of hidden meanings, patterns only initiates would recognize. You're walking now through one of those commanderies, its chapel open to the public centuries after the order's fall. The pillars are carved with vines and stars, but tucked among them is a motif that's out of place. A cluster of bees' wings outstretched as if frozen mid-flight. A guard passes you without comment, and you keep moving. The more you look, the more the details stack up. In one corner, a slab of stone worn smooth except for a shallow engraving, a chalice, but its base flares into the shape of a lily. In a narrow window, stained glass depicts not a saint, but a woman in a blue robe, a golden vessel in her hands, her hair a deep red. The label beneath simply reads, Maria. These are not the kinds of things a medieval church would normally celebrate, at least not without the approval of Rome. Which leads to the question that lingers like a draft under the door, were the Templars hiding something in plain sight? Their downfall comes in 1307, when King Philip the Mort of France, deep in debt to the order, arrests them en masse on charges of heresy. On Friday the 13th, a date that still carries the echo, they're accused of blasphemous rites, idolatry, even worshipping a mysterious head called Baphomet. Most of the confessions are wrung out under torture that details a messy tangle of truth, lies, and fear. But in the midst of it all, one fragment stands out. Several nights refer obliquely to knowledge too great for men, and to a line that stretches to the east and remains among us. Mainstream scholars say these are cryptic boasts or the ravings of broken men. But if you've been following the thread, they sound more like fragments of the same secret the Merovingians were said to guard. You leave the chapel and step back into the square, blinking in the daylight. The wind has picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain on distant stone. Somewhere behind locked doors and centuries of dust, there might still be chests of documents, genealogies perhaps spirited away before the arrests. Some believe they were smuggled to Scotland, others to Portugal, where the surviving Templars became the Order of Christ. Wherever they went, the theory goes, the mission didn't die. It simply changed hands. And as you walk away, the church bells toll in the distance, a deep, steady rhythm that sounds almost like shovels in the earth. The echo of those church bells hasn't faded when you find yourself climbing a hill under a hazy southern sun. Below the tiled roofs of a small French village spread out like terracotta scales. At its heart stands a modest church stone walls bleached pale by centuries of weather, a square bell tower rising above the houses. It's the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Rennes-le-Château, and it's about to introduce you to one of the strangest figures in this whole tangled story. The year is 1885. The new parish priest, Béranger Saunière, is young, energetic, and by all accounts, penniless. His church is crumbling, his presbytery barely habitable, and his parishioners few. You imagine him standing at the altar one cold morning, the wind slipping through cracked window panes, wondering how to keep the place from collapsing altogether. Renovations begin slowly, repairs to the roof, a fresh coat of paint. But then something changes. One day, Saunière starts tearing into the old altar. Inside a hollowed-out pillar, he reportedly finds a set of parchments. Here's where the story fractures into possibility and legend. Some versions say the parchments contained genealogies, names that tied the Merovingians to a surviving bloodline. Others say they were coded messages, perhaps even a map. Skeptics claim they were nothing more than old parish records. Historians still argue whether the parchments ever existed at all, Whatever he found, the effect was immediate. The modest repairs turn into lavish renovations. The church is transformed with intricate stained glass custom statues and a bizarre altar featuring demonic figures and Latin inscriptions. Near the entrance, the phrase, "By this sign you will conquer," appears in bold letters. In the churchyard, he commissions a statue of Mary Magdalene, her gaze cast down as if guarding a secret. And then there's the spending. Saunière, who only years before could barely afford candles, suddenly has funds for extensive building projects. He constructs the Tour Magdala, a tower with sweeping views of the surrounding countryside, ostensibly for his personal library. He builds a lavish villa, fills it with antiques, and entertains guests from Paris, scholars, aristocrats, even members of secret societies. When asked where the money comes from, he waves it off as donations. But local records show no large gifts, no wealthy patrons. The wealth seems to appear from nowhere. The people of Rennes-le-Château begin to whisper. Some say he discovered treasure left by the Knights Templar. Others believe he found proof of the sacred bloodline, a revelation valuable enough to buy silence from the highest powers in the church. Theories spiral outward, like the winding staircase inside his tower. One curious detail that fuels the fire during trips to Paris: Saunière visits the Church of Saint-Sulpice, famous for its connections to esoteric Catholicism and its strange gnomon, a brass line inlaid into the floor that marks the sun's path. He meets with known occultists, purchases rare books on alchemy and sacred geometry, and returns to Rennes with trunks of materials. You wander through the church today, and the clues are still there. The Stations of the Cross, which should be straightforward depictions of Christ's final hours, contain odd anomalies: soldiers wearing 17th century uniforms, landscapes that look suspiciously like the local countryside figures, whose gazes meet yours, as if breaking the fourth wall. Some visitors insist the arrangement encodes a message. Others see it as the eccentric flourish of a priest, with more imagination than orthodoxy. Outside the village is quiet, except for the cicadas. You walk toward the Tour Magdala. From its top, the land stretches in all directions, rolling hills, jagged ridges, and far to the south, the faint outline of the Pyrenees. If you were hiding something here, a tomb, a cache of documents, you'd have a clear view of anyone approaching. Saunière's later years grow stranger. The church investigates his finances and threatens excommunication, but he refuses to explain his wealth. His official defense: that he earned it by saying thousands of masses for the dead, an impossibility given the time frame. He dies in 1917 after a sudden stroke, his confession heard by a priest, who emerges visibly shaken and refuses to grant absolution. His loyal housekeeper, Marie Denarnaud, inherits everything and guards it fiercely. On her deathbed, she allegedly whispers, "The secret is so big, people would never believe it." You descend the tower steps slowly, the afternoon heat pressing in. Whether Saunière found gold documents or nothing at all, the effect is the same. Rennes-le-Château is now cemented in the mythology of the Merovingian bloodline. Treasure hunters still come mapping the hills for geometric alignments, scanning the earth for hidden chambers. Most leave empty-handed, but a few claim to have found markers, stone crosses, carved initials that hint at something deeper underground. And as you leave the village, the road winding down into the valley, you can't shake the feeling that the land itself is keeping watch. Somewhere between the B-marked coins and the star-shaped constellations in the hills, Saunière's legacy hums like a low note, reminding you that some secrets are measured not in years, but in how long people are willing to keep looking. The road out of Rennes-le-Château curls through a dry valley before climbing again into rougher country. The air gets thinner, sharper, carrying a tang of pine resin, and the faint, almost metallic scent of stone baking in the sun. You can see them ahead now, jagged limestone peaks jutting up like the spine of some ancient, sleeping creature. Somewhere up there on one of those heights is Montségur, the last stronghold of a people the church wanted, erased so completely that even their bones were meant to vanish. It's the spring of 1244, and the sky is a clear, unforgiving blue. Below the fortress, a ring of crusader tents flaps in the wind, their white crosses bright against the green slopes. The Cathars have been under siege for months. Supplies are gone. The streams are cut off. In the fortress, over 200 perfecti, the spiritual elite of the Cathar faith are preparing for the end. You climb the steep path toward the walls, each step pulling you further into the soundless tension of a place holding its breath. To the church, the Cathars were heretics. They rejected the authority of Rome, denied the necessity of its sacraments, and lived by a stripped-down faith that prized spiritual purity over worldly power. Their theology was dualist light and darkness, spirit and matter, and they saw the physical world as a prison created by a lesser corrupt god. In practice, that meant they lived simply refused to swear oaths and often welcomed women into positions of spiritual authority. It also meant they refused to pay the kinds of tithes and taxes that kept the medieval church fed and gilded. But here's where the story intersects with the thread you've been following. Among the rumors that swirled around the Cathars was one especially dangerous, that they held secret knowledge about Jesus' life, knowledge that contradicted the official gospel accounts. Some said they honored Mary Magdalene not only as a saint, but as a mother. Others claimed they preserved records, a gospel perhaps, or a genealogy that proved a bloodline had survived. Historians still argue whether this was anything more than propaganda designed to make their destruction seem urgent. But the overlap between Cathar territory and the supposed hiding places of Merovingian descendants is hard to ignore. You reach the summit, wind whipping around you. The fortress walls are rough, but imposing, their stones fitted without mortar, as if the hill itself had grown them. Inside, the air is heavy with resignation. The perfecti move quietly among the layfolk, offering the consolamentum, their single final sacrament, to those who ask for it. There is no panic here, just the slow, deliberate rituals of people who know what's coming. Down below, the crusaders are building something, a massive wooden pyre in the meadow at the base of the hill. The smoke from the cooking fires rises straight into the sky, unbroken by wind, as if the air itself doesn't want to move. On the morning of March the 16th, the gates open. The Cathars file out in silence, descending toward the field. They refuse to renounce their faith, even with the promise of mercy. One by one, they step into the enclosure built around the pyre. Witnesses later claim they sang as the flames rose. Over 200 people die that day, their voices swallowed by fire and mountain wind. But here's the detail that keeps the speculation alive. Just days before the surrender, a small group of Cathars supposedly escaped down the steep cliffs under cover of darkness. According to one account, they carried something with them, not gold or jewels, but a treasure whose nature was never recorded. Treasure hunters have searched for it for centuries, combing caves, rivers, and hidden valleys, convinced it must have been physical. Others argue it was knowledge, scrolls, codices, or even oral teachings meant to be passed to the next generation of guardians. The siege ends, but the war doesn't. Over the next decades, Catharism is hunted into extinction. Villages are razed. Manuscripts are burned. Even the memory of their beliefs is smeared by the victors. Yet in the cracks of history, small things survive. In certain churches in the Languedoc, fonts are shaped like grails. Frescoes show women with red hair holding vessels. The bee appears again, tucked into decorative borders. None of it is enough to prove anything, but all of it is enough to keep the questions alive. You stand now on the ridge above Montségur, the ruins stark against the sky. The wind is stronger here, carrying the smell of dry grass and something faintly sweet from the valley below. You can see for miles over forests, rivers, and the narrow paths that thread between them. It's easy to imagine someone slipping away into that landscape carrying a secret worth dying for. And maybe that's the real reason the church came down so hard on the Cathars. Heresy was one thing. Defiance was another. But a heresy that claimed to carry the living memory or the living blood of Christ, that was something no pyre could be too large for. As you turn to descend, the sun dips low, setting the meadow below in a wash of gold. For a moment, the burned field seems to shimmer, and you wonder whether somewhere beneath the grass, the earth still remembers the footsteps of the ones who walked out last. The path down from Montségur is steep, the loose stones sliding underfoot. By the time you reach the base, the meadow where the pyre once roared is hushed and cool, the grass swaying as if the wind itself is trying to smooth over what happened here. But the further you walk, the more you get the sense that some silences aren't born of forgetting they're engineered. And nowhere is that more true than in the place you're about to step into next. The air changes before you even see it. The warmth of the Pyrenean foothills gives way to a still, almost stale coolness, as though you've descended into the shade of something massive and enclosed. Ahead rises a high wall of pale stone, weathered smooth in some places, sharply edged in others. An ornate coat of arms crowns the main gate, the papal keys crossed above it. You're looking at one of the most restricted buildings on Earth, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The name itself used to be more honest, the Vatican Secret Archive, but secret was eventually swapped for apostolic to sound less like a Dan Brown plot device. Still, secret remains the more accurate descriptor. Behind these walls lies some 50 miles of shelving, millions of documents stretching back well over 1,000 years. Some are banal parish registries, receipts, diplomatic correspondence, but others are shrouded in enough rumor to make you want to press your ear against the gate and listen. You pass through a narrow courtyard into a reception chamber lined with shelves of neatly labeled boxes. This is as far as most people will ever get. Even accredited scholars must request documents by name and justify why they need to see them. There's no casual browsing, no wandering the stacks hoping to stumble across a revelation. The Vatican decides what's available and what isn't. Historians still argue whether the archive holds anything about the Merovingians, let alone a bloodline. But there are tantalizing hints. Papal correspondence from the 8th century, around the time the Carolingians replaced the Merovingians, is conspicuously incomplete. Whole sequences of letters vanish from the record, as if someone tore out chapters mid-book. Other inventories from the 13th century, coinciding with the final Cathar crusade, reference heretical genealogies confiscated in the Languedoc. These entries trail off without specifying what became of the materials. You imagine walking the deeper halls, the air growing cooler, the light dimmer. Somewhere past rows of ledgers and maps, you stop before a set of locked drawers with no external markings. It's easy to let your mind wander. Inside could be an apocryphal gospel that names Mary Magdalene as Jesus' wife, a genealogy tracing her descendants into the courts of Gaul, a letter from a monk confessing to hiding Sigisbert the Montfort in a remote abbey, or maybe nothing at all, just the weight of centuries and the human tendency to fill gaps with what we most want to find. One of the most persistent rumors about the archive comes from a 17th century Jesuit scholar, Athanasius Kircher. In a letter to a colleague, he described seeing a manuscript written in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, sealed in a copper box and labeled Sanguis Veritatis, the blood of truth. He claimed it undermines the foundations of dogma with lineage and names too ancient to refute. Whether this was hyperbole, misdirection, or a genuine description, he never mentioned it again. A more modern whisper comes from the 1950s, when a Vatican librarian named Father Gianni gave a single cryptic comment to a journalist asking about missing medieval records. "Some truths are not lost," he said. "They are withheld to protect what should never be questioned." The Vatican officially denies holding anything about the Merovingians or a sacred bloodline, and perhaps they're telling the truth. But the denial always feels rehearsed, as if the greater danger isn't in what's hidden but in what people might do if it were confirmed. Because if such a lineage existed, it could shift the foundation of the Church itself from an institution claiming divine authority through apostolic succession to one facing competition from living descendants of the divine. You step back out into the Roman sunlight, blinking against the brightness. The bells of St. Peter's ring out in the distance, echoing off the cobbled streets. Whatever lies inside those vaults, fact, fiction, or something between, remains beyond reach. But the knowledge that something is there sealed away is almost worse than ignorance. It's like seeing a locked door in the corner of a familiar room, a door you've never noticed before, and realizing you may never learn what's behind it. The wind carries the faint smell of incense from a nearby chapel. You pause the crowds moving around you and picture again those endless shelves, the drawers without labels, the copper box with its trilingual script. Somewhere in that cool, dry silence, the story you've been following might be sitting untouched, waiting. Or maybe it's already gone spirited away, like Sigisbert in the night, hidden where no record can name it. Either way, the trail feels alive again, pulling you forward past locked gates and official denials toward the next turn in the labyrinth. You leave Rome with the feeling that the air itself is heavier behind you, as though the Vatican's locked shelves are still watching. The train clicks north through rolling fields, vineyards flashing by in the sunlight, and soon you're crossing the Alps. The peaks rise like jagged teeth snow, still clinging to their crowns even in summer. On the far side, the land opens into wide green valleys dotted with towns that wear their history in stone. Here you begin chasing a curious leap in time, how the bee, that quiet Merovingian emblem, vanished for centuries, only to reappear stitched into the robes of an emperor who wanted the world to think of him as more than a man. It's December 2nd, 1804, and Paris is shimmering under winter light. The air inside Notre Dame Cathedral is thick with incense, and the crowd of dignitaries buzzes with anticipation. Napoleon Bonaparte, short, stocky, and radiating the kind of energy that makes people step aside without realizing it is about to crown himself Emperor of the French. The Pope sits nearby, a ceremonial presence, but everyone knows this coronation is on Napoleon's terms. And when the imperial robe is unfurled, gasps ripple through the assembly. Not for its opulence, but for its embroidery. Dozens upon dozens of golden bees, each no bigger than a thumbnail, glint in the candlelight. They're not the Bourbon fleur-de-lis, the symbol of the dynasty Napoleon has replaced. These are older, stranger, and if you've been paying attention, far more loaded. Officially, Napoleon claimed he chose them after a trove of golden bees was unearthed in Tournai in 1653, believed to be from Childeric Varp's tomb. To him, they symbolized French industriousness and continuity. But for anyone with a taste for hidden histories, the bees were a wink at something deeper, a lineage bypassing both Carolingian and Capetian claims. Reaching back to a time when kings were long-haired and crowned by birthright. After his coronation, Napoleon had the bee stamped onto coins, carved into state furniture, and embroidered on banners. It even appeared on his personal seal. For a few years, the emblem buzzed across Europe, riding on the back of his armies. Then, after his defeat, it slipped back into the margins again, never entirely gone, but never as brazen as that moment in Notre Dame. Your train of thought, like the real one you've stepped off in Edinburgh, turns toward another strange outpost of this story, Rennes-le-Château. The mid-15th century stonework rises above the green hills of Midlothian Scotland, like a puzzle carved into a church. Built by William Sinclair, a nobleman with rumored ties to the Knights Templar. Rosslyn is famous for its dense carvings, angels playing bagpipes, cornstalks carved decades before Columbus sailed west, and patterns that echo Masonic symbolism. Inside, the air is cool and smells faintly of dust and stone. Shafts of light filter through narrow stained glass, striking the ornate pillars. The most famous, the apprentice pillar, is wrapped in spirals of vines so detailed you can see each leaf vein. Tucked among the foliage are small winged creatures, some angels, some that look suspiciously like bees. Above them, star patterns are set into the ceiling. A few match known constellations. Others defy easy identification. Local lore says the Sinclairs inherited guardianship of a treasure brought from Jerusalem by the Templars. Possibly relics, possibly documents, possibly something more shocking. One fringe theory claims Rosslyn's intricate carvings are a map pointing to a burial site somewhere in the chapel or in the vaults beneath it. In some tellings, that burial isn't of a treasure chest at all, but of a person, a direct descendant of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Historians scoff, pointing out there's no evidence the Sinclairs ever possessed anything so extraordinary. But they can't quite explain away all the coincidences. The Sinclair coat of arms features an engrailed cross, a design also used by some Templar families. Several generations of Sinclairs were Freemasons, at a time when Masonic lore was steeped in Templar romanticism. And then there's the architectural quirk Rosslyn's floor plan mirrors that of Solomon's Temple down to the positioning of certain columns. You wander slowly, tracing your fingers over the cold stone. A guide's voice drifts over from the far aisle, talking about how the chapel's foundations extend into sealed vaults. Officially, they've never been opened in modern times. Unofficially, stories abound of attempts to break in each ending abruptly, whether due to structural collapse, legal threats, or sudden loss of funding. Stepping back outside, the Scottish air is sharp and clean. You look out over the hills and think about how the bees keep flying through this story, vanishing, reappearing, never quite explaining themselves. From Childrick's tomb to Napoleon's robe to Rosslyn's carvings, they're like a low hum beneath the louder notes of history. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the survival of a symbol doesn't depend on it being understood, just on it being seen again and again until someone notices the pattern. The bee doesn't need to tell you what it means. It just needs to keep landing where you can't help but see it. The road from Rosslyn winds through green Scottish hills, the kind that seem to roll forever, soft and deceptively gentle. But you're not staying here. The trail you've been following through symbols, ruins, and whispered names turns now toward a different kind of map. Not the sort printed on parchment and tucked into a leather satchel, but one drawn in fragments, scraps of medieval charts, half-legible Latin notations, and lines that don't just connect towns, they connect stars. You're in a quiet study lined with books whose spines are faded into the color of old tea. The table before you is strewn with documents, copies of Templar route maps, monastic property records, and something stranger, a folded sheet showing the Languedoc region from a bird's-eye view. Several points are marked, not with crosses or circles, but with 7 pointed stars. When you connect those stars in the order they're numbered, the shape that emerges is deliberate, a heptagram stretched across valleys, rivers, and ridgelines. Each point falls on a site tied in some way to the story you've been tracing. Rennes-le-Château, Montségur, Bézu, Blanchefort-Serre, and 2 isolated chapels whose names rarely appear in guidebooks. The scale is too large for coincidence. Fringe historians and amateur sleuths call this a geomantic pattern, a kind of sacred geometry imposed on the landscape. The idea is ancient: align your most important sites with the paths of the stars or the arcs of the sun, and you create a network that's both symbolic and, in some mystical systems, protective. Mainstream scholars roll their eyes sometimes with reason, given how easy it is to find shapes if you're determined enough. But this particular alignment resists easy dismissal. The lines don't just match earthly geography. They mirror the arrangement of a specific constellation, Aquila the Eagle, on the night sky of March 16, 1244. The night Montségur fell. You lean back, letting the detail sink in. If the pattern is intentional, then whoever created it wasn't just marking important locations, they were anchoring them to a date, a moment, perhaps even to the treasure that left Montségur under cover of darkness. Maps like this are notoriously tricky. Medieval cartographers weren't aiming for modern accuracy. Rivers bend the wrong way. Mountains shift size depending on their symbolic importance. But layered over modern coordinates, this one holds. The lines pass through real, tangible places, chapels with unusual iconography, caves, with restricted access hilltops, where the stone underfoot feels as though it's been worked by human hands long ago. Some of the sites are tied to known history. One chapel contains frescoes of Mary Magdalene standing beside a man who is not Christ, but dressed in kingly robes, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of a young boy. Another hilltop marks the ruins of a watchtower that, according to local legend, was used by monks to signal the approach of pilgrims who were not pilgrims. But others resist explanation. A stone circle on a remote ridge overgrown with moss matches no known Celtic or Roman site. A cave whose entrance is blocked by a dry, stacked wall bears no sign of collapse. It's intact, deliberate, meant to be sealed. And near the center of the heptagram, a meadow without any building at all yet, with soil that contains fragments of carved sandstone bearing faint bee motifs. Historians still argue whether patterns like this are the result of human design or the randomness of survival. After all, only certain sites remain intact after centuries of war weather and neglect. But you can't shake the feeling that this one has intent behind it, as if it's less a map to treasure than a lock, with each site serving as a tumbling wheel in the mechanism. And then there's the sky. The heptagram pattern's alignment with Aquila might be mere symbolism, an eagle for a noble house or for ascension or for victory. But there's another possibility whispered in certain esoteric circles, that it marks a time to act. In some occult traditions, when a terrestrial pattern matches its celestial counterpart, the gate between worlds or between eras opens. If that's true, then the night Montségur fell might not have been just a tragedy. It could have been a signal. You fold the map carefully, aware that even reproductions have a kind of gravity. In the corner, someone has scribbled a note in French, "La clef n'est pas dans les pierres, mais dans les noms." The key is not in the stones, but in the names. It's a reminder that places aren't the only coordinates worth following. Names of towns, families, rivers carry memory long after monuments crumble. And some of those names, if you trace them far enough, bend toward a lineage that official history insists ended in the 8th century. Outside, the evening light is fading, and the first stars prick the sky. You find Aquila easily, its wings spread wide, its beak pointing toward the southern horizon. And in the silence, you wonder, not for the first time, whether the people who built these alignments thought of themselves as keeping a secret, or simply as keeping a promise. The study's lamplight fades, and the table full of maps and parchment dissolves into the hush of a narrow stone passage. Your footsteps echo in the dark, each step bringing you closer to a heavy wooden door banded with iron. When you push it open, the scent of old dust and candle smoke rushes out, carrying with it the faintest trace of something sweeter, like dried lavender or the ghost of incense from a mass held centuries ago. The room beyond is small and circular, its walls lined with shelves. Not grand like a cathedral library, but private, built for the keeping of a handful of things worth more than gold. In the center stands a wooden table. Upon it, a single object lies beneath a linen cloth. You hesitate, and that's when you hear it, the quiet sound of pages turning, though you can see no one else here. When you pull back the cloth, you find a book not thick, but bound in leather so worn the edges have gone soft. The cover bears no title, only a small pressed emblem of a bee within a 7-pointed star. You open it carefully. The ink is brown with age, the handwriting cramped and deliberate. It's not a diary, not exactly. It's more like a ledger crossed with a family Bible, dates places, and names stretching across the centuries. Some you recognize instantly: Dagobert II, Sigisbert IV. Others are stranger, half familiar, because they match towns or valleys you've passed through in your journey. The entries weave from royal halls into villages, monasteries, farmsteads, never lingering too long in one place. Each line is like a step taken to keep moving forward without being seen. And then, at the end, there's a name with no date, no place. Just 2 words, and underneath a small flourish of ink that might be the start of another line. But it stops mid-stroke, as if the writer heard someone coming and shut the book. Historians still argue whether documents like this could survive without being noticed. Official archives are catalogued. Private collections are bought and sold. War scatters the rest. But here's the truth that never makes it into the scholarly debates: some things survive, because they're too unbelievable for anyone in power to bother hunting down. The more impossible they sound, the safer they are in plain sight. You set the book down. The air in the room feels heavier now, as if it's pressing in, not menacing, just watchful. And you realize that all along the question hasn't really been whether the bloodline exists. The question is why, if it does, so many people have chosen to protect it. The easy answer is power control over who sits on thrones or who holds moral authority over billions. But sitting here, you suspect it's something quieter. Maybe the people who kept this secret weren't trying to crown someone. Maybe they were trying to shield them. After all, a living descendant of Christ would be less a ruler than a target. Every faction, every faith, every skeptic with something to prove would pull at them from all sides until there was nothing left but the politics of their existence. You leave the room and step into the night. The air is cool, carrying the damp scent of stone and earth. Above you, the stars are sharp and bright, and there, just east of the zenith, is Aquila, the eagle. It's not glowing with mystical energy, not shifting into some secret symbol, but it's there all the same, exactly where it's always been. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Whether the bloodline is real, whether the documents are true, the power of the story is in its endurance. Through assassinations in forests, voyages across seas, sieges and burnings, vaults and archives, the thread has never quite been cut. Each time it's about to vanish, it flickers back, sometimes in a symbol, sometimes in a rumor, sometimes in the embroidery on a robe, and perhaps that's enough. Because stories like blood can be carried quietly through the centuries. They don't need to be shouted to survive. They just need to be told again to someone willing to listen. You start walking the gravel, crunching under your boots. The night is deep now, the kind that swallows distant sounds and slows your thoughts. Somewhere in the dark, a bee hums past your ear, its path untraceable, its purpose its own. You think of the fleur-de-lis carved above the old chapel door, the sealed cave in the hills, the line in the map that pointed not to stones, but to names. And as the path curves out of sight, you feel it, that same quiet hum you've been chasing across centuries. Not the demand for proof, not the clamor of conspiracy, but the steady, enduring pulse of something that refuses to let go. The night settles around you like a blanket, the air softening, the wind losing its bite. Your steps slow, and the gravel underfoot becomes quieter, as though the road itself is urging you to rest. The stars overhead don't feel distant anymore. They're just faint lanterns keeping watch. You think back over the places you've wandered tonight. The cold forest, where a king's life ended the salt-bitten shore. Where a woman stepped onto new land, the hill where flames took the last of the Cathars, the locked doors of the Vatican, the quiet geometry hidden in the earth. They don't feel like separate points anymore. They're pieces of one long breath drawn in 1,000 years ago, and still being exhaled now. Even the unanswered questions seem softer here. Whether the bloodline is fact or fable doesn't press so urgently. It's enough to know that people have cared enough to remember to guard, to weave it into symbols so small they could be mistaken for ornament. It's enough to imagine that in some quiet place, a name continues to be spoken by someone who knows why it matters. The night air carries a faint, warm scent, lavender maybe, or something older. The sound of water somewhere nearby blends with the rustle of leaves, a rhythm slow enough to match your breathing. You can feel your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclench. When you finally stop walking, the ground beneath you is steady and the sky above is calm. Whatever truths lie buried in vaults or caves or bloodlines will still be there tomorrow. For now, the story has done what it needed to do. It's wrapped around you like the soft hum of a bee's wing, and the world feels quiet enough to sleep.